All right, welcome to this short video on Tableau and month and current month and previous month comparison. So we're going to take 5 steps in total and do kind of a walkthrough how to implement that with Tableau. And the first step that we need to take here is we create a month and year calculated field that basically extracts the two values from the date occurred field that we have in our crime data. In the second step, we create parameters based on those fields. A parameter is basically something the user can select, and we will offer the user a drop-down field where he or she can select the year and the month from this parameter. In the third step, we will create the field, a calculated field for the current month, which displays the number of incidents for the currently selected month. And in the fourth step, we do the same, but for the previous month. And if we have both fields, we can, in the fifth step, then create a field that displays the difference in percent between the current and the previous month. Okay, let's start with the first step and look right into Tableau how we can do that. So what I did is I opened the .hyper file, which is the Tableau extract for the crime LA data, which you can download. And if you open that file, you will get a view like this. So it just opens the data source and you see all the columns. So since we already know that those columns are all correct and we have all the necessary data available, let's jump right into the sheet. And when we click on the sheet, we will see all the dimensions and measures as we're used to. So we can now take the first step, and what we want to do is create a calculated field that displays only the month from the date occurred field, which is this one, and only the year for the date occurred field in another calculated field. Okay, so how can we create a calculated field? It's very easy. You simply right-click somewhere in the measure or dimensions pane and click Create Calculated Field. Then you get this dialog, and you can first type in a name. And I'll name the first one month occurred. So that basically gives us the information that this will be the month. And we already know there's a function that we can use, which is called month, and then we give it a date. And you see the calculation is valid. I click on apply and OK. And you see down here we have a new measure in this case. This is actually not a measure in our case. So what I want to do is I want to convert it to a dimension. I click convert to dimension and I got the field in my dimension pane. So now I can drop it simply into the rows and see what it actually contains. And as expected, it contains the numbers for each month. Okay, let's create another one and do the same for the year. And I call that one year occurred. And I use the year function, similar to the date function, and apply it to the date occurred field. And it's also valid. And I can simply add that, and I also want to create this to convert this into a dimension. So I have it down here. All right. Additionally, just for display purposes, because I don't just want to have the month here, I want to show you how you can also create a field that contains the month names. So I create another one. That's not actually necessary for the calculation previous and current month, but I'll do it anyway because it displays nicer. So month name occurred, I call that one to distinguish it from the month occurred. And what we can do is we can use the function date name, and this returns a part of the specified date as a string. And the first parameter is what part do we want to get as a string, and if we put it in single quotes and type month, and then we apply it to the date occurred field, what it does is it will create the month as a name, and you see this here. So I use the month as a name, and we can also use both fields here. Just add another one so you have both in this table. All right, that's it for step 1 already. Let's move over to step 2. Okay, so in step 2, we're going to create 2 parameters, and those parameters are going to be based on the fields, the calculated fields that we just created. So how can we create a parameter? Simply right-click on anywhere in the measures pane and click create parameter. This will open a dialog like this, and you can first of all give that parameter a name, and I will call the first one month parameter. And now we can choose what data type this one is going to have. And this one is going to be an integer. So we can now say that this type of parameter is going to be, so the allowable values are going to be coming from a list. And we can also say, if we click on list, we can say that we want to have this list created from a field. And that is exactly the field that we have just created. So month occurred is going to be what I'll select here. And you already see that you get all the values from this field, which is basically the month 1 to 12. Now we can use a nice feature, because in the display later on, when the user selects this parameter from the drop-down menu, I would like to offer him a view that gives him the names of the month. So I'll replace these display as values with the names of the month. So January, February, March, oops, that was a typo. So March, April, May, June, July, September, October, November. So this is to change whatever is displayed for this parameter. So if I click on OK and click on this parameter down here, so you see parameters is a new pane down here, and we can click on the little arrow and say show parameter control. And what it does is it opens up this little drop-down menu here, and it gives us now all the values that we have just set as display values that we can choose from. Now currently this does nothing, because we just created the parameter, but we have not used the parameter anywhere. So you can select all you want, but it won't change anything in the visualizations or the table that we created. So in this case, in this step, we want to create the second parameter for the year as well. So I call that year parameter. And again, this data type is an integer. And we also want a list of allowable values that come from the year occurred field that we have just created. And now we want to change the data format, because usually we use the year as a string because it's a discrete value that the user can select, and we do usually not calculate with a year. But in this case, it makes sense because we're going to compare it to numbers later on. So I just change the display format right here. So I say it should be a custom number. I don't want any decimal places, and I don't want to include the thousands operator. And if I do that, you see that the display is now, as we expected, it looks like a string. If I click on OK, and I also add this parameter to the control, you see that we have another parameter. We can choose the year from the drop-down field. Now, once again, this doesn't do anything currently because we have not used the parameters, either month or year, in any calculation. We'll do that in the next step. Okay, now it's getting interesting. We are going to create a calculated field using the parameters that we've just created. So how do we create a calculated field? Right-click, create calculated field anywhere in the measures pane. And the first thing that I would like to do is create a calculated field for the current month number of incidents. So I call this month, or I call this number incidents current month. So speaking names are important, especially if we have calculated fields and we don't know which does what. It's important to have speaking names. Okay, so now it becomes interesting. How can we use this parameter to calculate the number of incidents in the current month? So the basic idea is we check the month from the date occurred field and check whether this month equals the value of the parameter that is currently selected. So if the user is selecting January, the value will be 1, and we can check whether the value of the date occurred field when we extract the month is also 1. And in that case, we would like to display the number of incidents. And if that's not the case, we don't want to display anything. So we basically say we display a 0. So we can do that kind of stuff with the if statement. So if, and then we need to define a condition. So if, and now I would start with a month. So the month from the date occurred gives us the number of the month in the data, and that must be equal to the parameter value that we've just created. So it's basically the month named, the month parameter. So if that's the case, then I would like to have this calculated field display the number of records. If not, then it should display 0. So this already works, but there's one thing missing. So if we click apply and I use this new field and put it into my table, what you'll see is, and we also add the year occurred in the columns, what you see is that we get a value now for each year that we have selected, but it already works for the month. So if I select May, it will display the May values, but for every year. But I only want it for the year that I selected. So what I need to do is I also need to include in my calculated field the year. And that is basically I have to add another condition and combine it with the current condition. So what we say is not just must the month match, but also the year of the date occurred must be equal to the year parameter in this case. So if I add this and I click on apply, I get the information that this contains errors. I guess I did something wrong with here's a parenthesis missing. So year, I need to close that. And now it should work, and I click on apply. And what you see is that actually now we only see a value for July 2016, and this is exactly what we chose here. And if I click on June, it will give me the June value. And now if I change this to 2013, it will show the value for 2013. So now this calculated field gives us the current, so the number of incidents for the currently selected month. And that's a first step. And now in the next step, let's look at how we can create the same thing, but for the previous month. Okay, so the calculated field for the previous month is a little bit more complicated, but not by that much. So what we can do is we can make a copy of the number of incidents for the current month because it will be similar and we just have to adjust it slightly. So I clicked on edit, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to copy it. So click on copy, and what it will do, it will create a copy, and you paste that copy, you get the exact same copy, and you have the name 1 behind it. This is the one that I'm going to edit. So I click on this little arrow, click on edit, and first I'll give it another name. And this is not the current, but the previous month. So I'll remove the brackets and the 1 and the previous month as a name. So what should happen here? The previous month is actually the month parameter minus 1. So if I actually change it here and say this should be minus 1, that already does part of the trick. So I click on apply, and instead of the number of incidents for the current month, I'll use the one for the previous month now, and let's see what this does. So you see that we have June and 2013 selected, and the value we see here is actually May 2013. So we see that this already works. If I select March, we see the February value and so forth. If I use December, it's the November value. That's exactly what we'd expect. However, there's one problem. What if we choose January? All of a sudden, nothing happens anymore. So that's because January is 1 and 1 minus 1 equals 0. So it's looking for the data where the month of date occurred is 0. But that does not exist, obviously. So we need to take special care of the January value. And let's do that by editing the field. So what we can do is we can introduce another if statement. And we can say if the month parameter value is 1, then we need to do something more special. And if it's not 1, so the else part, we can do what we did before. So what should happen then if the month parameter is 1? Well, if the month parameter is 1, then we are looking for the value of month 12, right? So because we always know the previous month from January is December of the previous year. So we do simply look at not the month parameter, but we can say, okay, we're looking for month 12 and not of the current year, but of the year before that. So year parameter minus 1 should do the trick. The calculation is valid, so I click on apply. And we can already see that for January 2013, in the table, we see the value for December 2012, and that's exactly what we want. So let's see if it still works for other month and year, and it obviously does. So 2013, we get the April value when we choose May, And if we choose August, we see the July value. So that's two calculated fields that help us creating a month and previous month comparison. We could basically compare the 2 months, and we want to finalize that using a third calculated field that displays the percentage, so the difference from the current to the previous month as a percentage, and we can then use that in our map. Okay, last but not least, let's create a third calculated field that contains the difference as a percentage between the current month and the previous month. So what I do is, again, I right-click somewhere in the measures pane and say create calculated field, and we'll give that the name number incidence difference in percent. So how do we calculate that? So we have all the data available in the two calculated fields that we created previously. So what we do is we basically use the number of the current month and divide it by the number of the previous month, because that way, if the current month is larger, then we get larger than the previous month, we'll get a number that is larger than 1. And if not, we'll get a number that's smaller than 1. And if we subtract 1 from that, we will get a negative value if the current month is actually smaller than the previous month. And so we would see that we have like a negative percentage, which means we have less crimes in the current months. And that's exactly what we want. Now it's important that we don't leave it just like that, because this case, if we don't have any aggregation function, it would calculate this value for every row. So for every row, it would calculate the number incidents current month divided by the number incidents previous month, and it would create that percentage, and it would sum up the percentage for all rows. And that doesn't make any sense, because percentages, you cannot sum them up. What you need to do instead is you need to create the sum of the incidents for the current month before you divide that by the sum of number of incidents of the previous month, and then you can subtract the 1, and if you have that number, it gives you the percentage in any constellation of dimensions. So I click on apply, and that's our new field. So now let's see how we can use that field. In this configuration here, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, and let's see why. So if I drag and drop the number of incidence differences into the text field, and I also add the current month to the text field, so we see that we have all 3 numbers, and we have yet to do one more thing. Let's format this field. So number of incidence difference in percent. I click on default properties and then number format, and we can change it to percentage right here. 2 decimal places is fine with me. Click on OK, and you will see that we get a percentage here. But that does not make much sense, because as you can see, for August, which is our selected month, we don't even have a value for the difference in percent, but for July we have minus 100%. So why is that? So the problem here is that to calculate the difference in percent, we need actually to look at 2 months, namely August and July in this case. But if we look at the data in one cell like this, it will always have only 1 month available, and the formula, for example, for July, it is trying to look to get the value for the previous month. It will look at if the date, so the month of the date occurred is the current month minus 1, which would be June, but we don't have June in this cell available, so there is no data for that. So it simply returns 0, and that's also why we have this weird value here, and there's no value for August at all. So it doesn't make any sense to look at the difference in percentage as we calculated it in a cell where we have this. You can view this as a filter. So when we look at this cell, he only has the July data available for 2013, and that's obviously not enough to calculate the difference for June, and for August the same. It's not enough to calculate the difference for July, because you need more data than that. So let's clear this sheet and create a different view where we can actually see how it works. So I can use this dimension field measure names and pull it to the rows. And then I can use the measure values and pull them to the text. And what this gives me is, it gives me basically a list of all the measure names that I have down here, and it will give me all the values in this table. And this is quite nice, because now I can add a filter on measure names, show that filter, and then I can select only the measures I care about. So these are these three that we've created. And there you can see that there's actually some number that makes sense. So we need to also show the control for the parameter month and year to make more sense out of it. So for August 2013, we have the previous month, which would be July, it's 16,592, and for the current one, it's something 17,000. So the difference is a positive 4.71%. That makes absolutely sense. And in this case, you see that in this table, we don't have a cell that is already narrowed down to a month and a year, and that's why we can actually calculate it. We don't have a filter on month. So we can recreate that. If I now created a filter on month for date occurred, I could do that, and I could say I don't want to actually filter, but I want to show that filter along with the parameter control. So I could now select February. You will see the same weird behavior again. So there's actually nothing that we could calculate that our calculated fields could work on. So I'm going to remove that filter altogether and remove it. It will be gone, and you can see that it makes sense again. So now it works, and even if we use January, it will calculate the difference to the previous year, December 2012 in this case, and now we have correct differences in percent. So now, of course, we can use this measure, for example, to use it in a map and display differences between zip codes, for example, like you are supposed to do in the case study part B. All right, I hope you could follow along creating these calculated fields, parameters, and you can now hopefully apply them successfully in your case study. So I wish you all the best and see you in the next video.